Okay, so hopefully we have gone live. It says we're live. Hey everyone, Sheila here from Life with Pets. So can you let me know if you can hear me? This is the first time we've ever done a Google Hangout with somebody else, so it would be helpful to know if you can hear me okay. Let's just see if it's come through yet. It says it's broadcasting, so hopefully it is. Can you guys let me know? Oh, you can hear us? Oh, that's great. Thank you, Nisi. Thank you, Ethan. Okay, all right. Well, hi, guys. Thank you for stopping by. This is the first live stream I've ever done this way, so this is going to be a little different. Normally, I'm moving around all the fish tanks, but today I thought it'd be great to do a sit down and talk about breeding betta fish. And somebody who I have been getting a lot of advice from is Amber from Big City Bettas. And so I just thought that it would be good to answer your questions and just talk about breeding in general. So Amber, can you introduce yourself? I'm sure everybody already knows you, but just introduce yourself and tell them just a little bit about your fish keeping experience.
Like Sheila said, I'm Amber from Big City Bettas. I've been keeping and breeding domestic Betta splendens for many, many years. I've just actually gotten back into the breeding hobby, so I'm building up my fish room and started my channel actually because of Sheila and actually Kasha from Creative Pet Keeping. I've been in contact with both of them through their whole, channel process, and with Kasha, her breeding process, and they're both just really encouraging and supportive. So here I am.
Okay, that is great. So if you guys have any questions on betta breeding, then just put them in the chat and we will try and do our best to answer them. So I am going to start off, Amber, with a question for you. If somebody is wanting to get into breeding fish, what is probably the best advice you could possibly give them?
I think the best advice would be to do your research. And by do your research, I mean talk to everyone who has experience. Talk to everyone you possibly can. Ask as many questions as you have or can come up with, and really research, on Google and through various forums and websites what other people are doing so you can go into it prepared, because I think there are a lot of things that starting out people don't realize, and some of them can be the difference between a spawn living and dying. So I think research would be key.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I hear so much about people are just going to get some bettas and try putting them together, but I don't think that they realize that it's not like, say, having guppies that they're live bearers and they just basically take care of themselves near enough. Whereas with betta fish, because of all the separating at the end, it's not like you can just keep a tank full of them. I don't think people realize just the work that's involved and the food that need to be fed and stuff like that. I think that sometimes that's very overlooked because they are a very different fish to breed than, like I say, the likes of, say, live bearers and that sort of fish. So what advice would you give there as in how to prepare for something like that?
Well, for bettas, I think the best way to prepare for that, potential amount of fry is to see what foods you can do yourself. Things like banana worms, Walter worms, micro worms, these all can be cultured and recultured. So you're paying the initial cost of a starter, and then if you stay on top of it and change out, whatever substrate you're using, oatmeal, baby cereal, instant potatoes, whatever it might be, if you change that in the amount of time you're supposed to and feed them, they're going to keep going for you. So that, the first month and a half, that can be your fry food. Buying baby brine shrimp in bulk, figuring out, like I make gel food at home, which long run saves me a ton of money. Things of that nature. And also just be ready to do a lot of water changes, because that's kind of the big part of the whole process is you have to change out the water a lot, even if it's clean. I've found mine don't grow nearly as fast if I don't clean the water out as often as I should, or as often, as is ideal. So.
Yeah, I think that side of it is often very overlooked, is the time that it takes, the time commitment that it takes to do them, especially I think when they're very young, because obviously you've got to be careful not to suck any up. And then as they get older, just because you've got so many in a tank, then you've got to do even more water changes because there's so many in a tank. So I think that is something that is really overlooked. So I've got a question here from The Beast Random, and they have asked, how much will one betta produce? I'm assuming they're talking about fry. So how many fry can one betta fish produce, or a pair, I should say, produce?
Well, in my experience, it's been anywhere from 20 that actually survive and make it to free swimming to over 300, like well over 300, probably closer to 400. So it depends on the individual pair and how many survive, really.
Okay. So do you find then that the more a fish breeds, the bigger the batch gets each time, or does it not? Sort of like with guppies, very often, like the first time they get pregnant, it's a lot smaller, and then as they get bigger, or as they get older, they can get a lot bigger. Is that the same for betta fish or not?
Personally, I've found that it really has to do more with the individual female and how much you're feeding them, not really age. Okay. So as they get older, they will slow down egg production wise.
Okay.
But that's much later on.
Let's have a look and see what we've got. I don't even know where to start with all these questions. Okay, so I've got, how could I save money in the process of breeding? And then anything, and then I'm not quite sure what they're saying, stuff like that. So any tips, I think, is probably what they're saying, in how you can sort of save money through the process of breeding.
Buy cheaper catappa leaves. Don't go for the ironed, grade A, perfect, flat little leaves. Buy the cheaper, kind of curled up with holes in them. It really doesn't matter. It's going to stain your water with the tannins that you need either way. Switch to a bulk, cheap kitchen salt instead of aquarium salt. So it's the exact same thing. As long as it has no iodides in it and no anti-caking, you'll be fine. Try and see however many foods you can make at home or culture on your own, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But really, it gets expensive. There's no way I've found around it, at least not as far as what equipment you really need to do it properly.
Yeah, I think I would say the same thing, really, because at the end of the day, you've still got to have the tanks, you've still got to have the food, obviously all the water changes, everything has to be sort of taken into account. And it's not just that. For me, I think it's the end process of all the jarring. That jars are not cheap. The more I've sort of researched into how am I going to jar? I mean, I sort of counted 40 last night, and I'm sure there's a lot more in there now. I know that all those may not survive, but I'm sort of starting to think, I could be needing 40 jars, depending on if there's 80 in there and 20, sort of maybe 30, 40 survive. And that's a lot of jars if you've got a lot of males. And so things like that. And then there's also the rehoming them, or if you're going to ship them. I'm floored at how much it costs to ship, and all the proper supplies and all that sort of stuff. I'm totally astounded by, when I've started adding it all up, the cost of even just shipping the fish is really expensive. So I do think that it's quite an expensive venture overall, I would say. Being new into it and having especially to get everything, you've already got the stuff, but at the end of the day, you've still spent the money, so there's a lot of money in breeding, I think, in general, but definitely when you've got to jar them individually, I think that just adds a whole different level to the cost factor as well. All right, if you see any questions at all on here, Amber, and you want to jump in, then just go ahead and do so. All right.
One person did ask if betta fish can have miscarriages. They cannot, because they're not live bears. A miscarriage is the early having of a fetus of some kind, be it like a partially formed fry. So like guppies and that kind of thing can have miscarriages, but bettas cannot.
Okay. All right, so let's see what else we've got on here. So what tank size should you have? So for me, I have I'm starting them off in a 10-gallon, which is right now just filled halfway, and then I'll eventually obviously be filling it all the way. And then their grow out tank is going to be a 20-gallon. So that's sort of what I'm going to do. What about you, Amber? Do you do the same, or do you do it differently?
Well, I use a 5-gallon, but that's just what works for me personally. A 10 gallon's fine, but with longer fin, I find they have a harder time doing, you know, what they need to do to spawn, which realistically starts with chasing. You got incredibly lucky with your pair.
Yeah. Yeah, I still sort of look back and I look at the footage and I just can't believe, you know, that for first-time parents as well, I just heard so many horror stories and read so many horror stories in all my research, and then to get a pair that were just so ready and so open to, they just did their thing, and it was, yeah, it was amazing. It was amazing to watch, and in fact that actually brings me to the next question. Now I know that people cannot watch their fish 24/7 like I did, but their mind did their thing within literally, you know, an hour or two of going in the tank. What would your suggestion be with that? Because since that video went out, I did get so many comments about the fish being beaten up because people weren't home to supervise, and like I say, I am very aware that people can't watch 24/7. Are there any tips that you can give people on that can maybe ease that?
Yeah, you know, honestly, for me at least, the pairs that have spawned and the pairs that have been properly conditioned, they spawned within the first 20 to like 36 hours of being released in the tank. And if you're setting out to breed bettas and invest that amount of time into what it takes to properly raise them, you know, water changes, all that, if you can't spare a day and a half to monitor the fish, I think perhaps you need to question whether you have enough time to put into the raising of the fish. I think it comes down to, you know, these fish were bred to be aggressive, and we're putting them in a glass box and asking them to spawn. So it comes down to us being responsible to what happens in that tank. You know, accidents do happen. You know, maybe you walked away for 10 minutes and you had a really aggressive fish and it just gave the other one a buzz cut, but I think most of these accidents can be prevented, but to an extent they're going to take damage. It's just how they spawn. I've in fact had females that would not spawn unless the male was hyper aggressive with them, and I think that's actually instinctual, because in any fish, in any animal in the wild, the more aggressive it is, especially with an aggressive natured animal, it's going to have a greater survival rate. So yeah, okay. I've got a question here. It's from Petite Fish, and it says, are brine shrimp, vinegar eels, micro/banana worms enough to start as foods? That's all I have at the moment. Definitely. I think that sounds like a great selection. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, right now I'm doing the micro worms and the banana worms, and then I will be going on to the baby brine shrimp, which I probably actually might try this weekend. I'm quite surprised over the last, in fact, I was just doing a video today for Tuesday, and I can't believe the growth in them. When I was trying to video them, when I was doing the water change, I could barely even get them on camera. They just seemed so tiny. Nothing would focus. It was just a nightmare trying to do this video. And then the next day, it was just unbelievable. It's like they'd grown like 10 times the size. I mean, they're still really tiny. They're not like huge, but the camera would focus, and they were like proper little fish. It was just amazing, the difference in them, you know. So, and all I've done to this point is the micro and the banana. I did the banana for probably the most. I think I started the micro worms. It was either yesterday or the day before, and I think I'm going to start on try the baby brine shrimp and see, you know, whether they'll take it or not, and go from there. So yeah, I would say that is definitely enough at this point. All right, let's see what else we've got here.
There is one I want to touch on. Someone is saying that Ray curling and fin curling is caused by a temperature fluctuation or poor water quality, and I've actually found that not to be the case. With my spawn I have right now, they're crown tail placots, and I was not feeding them calcium in their diet. I wasn't supplementing it, and I was getting really bad ray curling. And as soon as I started feeding my gel food and adding a ton of calcium into it, that ray curling stopped completely. And the ones that hadn't gotten it yet still haven't gotten it. And my water, I mean, I don't even get nitrates in my little jars because I keep that guppy grass from you and all of them. So, between that and the tannins, my water quality is perfect. And I was getting ray curling, and as soon as I supplemented calcium, that stopped. And it really makes sense if you think about it, because the rays are just bone segment encasing nerves and blood vessels. So calcium makes strong bones.
Right. Yeah, I've often wondered that, because I add that calcium into the gel food as well, because obviously I feed a lot of gel food to the snails, and I don't feed a great deal to the fish, but I do feed it to the fish. And I've often wondered about sort of I don't put a ton of calcium in. I do only do sort of a small amount, but I have often wondered. But like you say, that does make a lot of sense, because it is the bone. And so if that's lacking, then in theory you would expect it to make it stronger, not actually cause the issue. So yeah, I would totally agree with that. All right, let's see what else we've got. I've got no idea where we are with these comments. They keep jumping around. Let's see. How do you add calcium to food? I think, well, we've just touched on that, in that I do it in gel food. I don't know whether you do it a different way. Do you soak it? Do you add it to sort of soaking food as well, or do you just do it in your gel foods?
Just in my gel foods, but I'm sure you could soak it. A lot of people do that for the reptiles.
Yeah. I just do it in the gel food as well. The gel food recipe for me, somebody's saying, can you post your gel food recipe? Gordon, for me, I suppose I'm the lazy one, because I actually use the Repashy gel foods. I just found that easier from a time standpoint for me personally, but I do know that Amber does make a gel food. Now, she did post a video on it, and I think she's going to be doing a snail one as well, but you have a fish one, that's correct, yes?
Yes, and I'm going to be doing the snail one this weekend.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, go on over and check that out. And with any gel food, you can sort of supplement whatever you've got. You can basically put into it. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly what you see through videos or whatever, but at least it gives you ideas of what to do. And I do think making your own is a great idea, because I do think it does save an awful lot of time. When it comes to, or a lot of money, I should say, and time, I guess, when it comes to feeding your fish. All right, so let's have a look at some more. Beta Josh says, hey, Sheila and Amber. Beta Josh is in Australia. So he very often misses the streams because he's in Australia, and I usually stream a lot earlier, so it's usually way too early in the morning for him. So William Hawkins asks, how do you keep them from attacking each other before separating?
Do you mean like in the grow out, or?
I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what he's asking there. You need to be a little more specific, and just one question, not a load of questions. Yeah, if you could just be a bit more specific, whether you mean when they're breeding or when they've grown out, because again, I'm not sure on that either. All right, let's see. This keeps jumping up all over the place.
One person asked, do betta fish have to be the same breed for them to breed? I think that's a bit of a confusing question. I think the best explanation would be all the domestic bettas that we know, all the different tail types, placate, half moon, crown tail, whatever, double tail, elephant ear. These are all the exact same fish. They just have different mutations that have been heavily line bred to get a specific outcome. And it's kind of like various dog breeds that are derived from the same thing, only they actually do share the same genetics, these fish. So they're all the same thing. You can mix anything with anything, but I think some caution should be advised. I think not a lot of, but there are a number of mutations that, double tail, if you breed responsibly and keep an eye on the spines, you'll be fine. That's not a detrimental mutation. But something like a feather tail or a rose tail, that's something very different, because that's a mutation that is affecting the actual bones themselves. It's not just, two separate tail lobes or, oversized pectoral fins. So I think we need to know what we're breeding before we breed it. But theoretically, yes, you can breed any tail type with any tail type.
I've often wondered, because of all that's going on with the sort of the breeding for the bigger and bigger fins, it just seems to be the trend right now. Everyone's wanting these betta fish with big, really big flowing fins, and the poor things just can't swim. And I've often wondered what it would be like to, say, do a placotte with a half moon, so like a placotte female with maybe a half moon, or sort of like do sort of like the in between, something that's sort of in between, but it's, you sort of think, well, what would it produce? And you don't know. And obviously there's a lot of experimenting, and I'd hate to do something really wrong, but maybe sort of, I say, even shorten the tail to an extent so that you've not got this crazy long flowing tail where they just can't swim. I don't think people realize that these that have these huge fins, that eventually it causes them so many problems that they die an early death, because the fins are that big that they can't swim properly, and then they can't eat, and they basically just burn out. And I just think that that's so sad, that at the moment it seems to be a huge trend everywhere I go. It's just these pictures of these, I mean, they're gorgeous, but they're just, in the long term, not going to be very functional. And I just think it's cruel. I think it's very, very cruel. But like I say, I'm not into it enough to, sort of maybe try doing a completely, different sort of like different thing to try and maybe shorten or whatever. And it would be over generations as well. So you'd have to have a lot of time, I think, to do something like that. Have you done any projects like that?
Oh, absolutely. I'm doing that right now.
So what fish are you doing? Can you share that?
Yeah, right now I actually have a crown-tail placotte spawn going that was the result of a long-fin crown-tail female and a more restricted half-moon placotte, which is more just a showy placotte, to try and get a little bit longer raid crown-tail placottes than what I've been seeing, because they've been bred with the traditional placottes usually. So I'm playing around with that and seeing what comes out and if I like it. And in my opinion, as long as you're not breeding something that could be detrimental to the fish, have fun. But at the same time, there's something to be said about well-bred, solid lines. Like, when you see a really nice, well-bred half moon, like Kara McCulley's fish come to mind. Her half moons are just amazing. She has a white pair right now that are just phenomenal. I was actually talking to Simply Betta about them the other night, because they're just stunning fish. And you don't see that anymore because people don't breed, for a specific thing. A lot of people just play around with one or two spawns and then move on to something else. But if you stick with it and really line breed, you can get some amazingly consistent results and beautiful fish. So
now with veil tails, is that gene so dominant that if you were to, say, breed it with let's say a koi placotte, would it still, what would you expect to get? Would you get something in between, or would it take generations and generations to come up with something completely different?
My experience with veil tails is, if you breed a veil tail, you are going to pretty much always get veil tails. You might get a longer veil tail or a shorter veil tail, or it might be closer to a spade tail, but to an extent, you're always going to get veil tails. I've never been able to get anything other than a veil tail out of a spawn with one parent.
And is that the same with color as well? Because I know, like, the blue and the blue and the red is so dominant. Would that be the same with the coloring as well then?
No, coloring I actually have bred red out of a line. that I didn't want red in. It just takes a lot of very selective breeding and picking the right fish.
Which is very time consuming overall, because you've got to wait for them to come of age, and so that's a really extremely time consuming line. So these people that do this, they put years and years and years into it when they're doing it, which I think that's great, that because I've been seeing some really cool looking veil tails, sort of coming out, not just the traditional. There's an awful lot of colours available, and I've even seen a few koi, which have just been amazing. And I just thought the time that's gone into breeding those, I just can't even begin to imagine. I think that's, people have been very dedicated to get to that. That point where they've bred out, so much. So, okay, let's see. What have we got here? These comments have been going by, and I've not. How often should I feed my veil tail beta fish? I feed twice a day, usually morning and then mid to late afternoon, I would say. What about you, Amber?
Yeah, twice a day. I feed pretty heavily too.
Yeah.
You're feeding the correct foods at the correct temperature for their metabolism. You can just pour the food on, and they're happy for it. They're little piggies.
Yeah, I've been getting a lot of comments recently on one of my feeding videos that I am way overfeeding, and I only feed 2 pellets a day, and I think it's the one thing I see so much. So many people have an awful lot of underweight beta fish, and I don't think they realise it because they listen to the myth of it's as big, the stomach is as big as the eye, and because they listen to that, then they're feeding to that, and it is not the case. And like you say, you can feed. I mean, when we were feeding, now I know we were feeding for breeding, but even so, I was amazed how much she could eat, and him for that matter. And I've noticed that since he hasn't, obviously I didn't feed him for the first few days in the spawn tank. He just wasn't interested, so I didn't feed him. And I'm amazed how quickly he's dropped weight, and he's not putting it back on easily. So I've been feeding him even heavier. And when I'm doing it, I'm thinking, if people could see this, they would just be freaking out. But they can eat so much more. And I think the problem is, it's because so many people feed a lot of dried food. I think that's the issue. Whereas when it's a varied diet, it makes a big difference to the fish itself, because if they're getting a varied diet with your frozen foods, and it doesn't have to be live foods, but if they're available as well, then you're not putting all that dried into them, which obviously they're not used to, and that is usually what will sort of clog them up. And then that's what pellets then get. Oh well, if you feed too many, they then end up with this. Well, pellets cause bloat, and well, it's not necessarily pellets that cause the bloat, it's the diet that the fish is being given that causes the bloat, although the pellets might be the culprit just because of how many have been fed and so on over a period of time. So I do think that feeding I think it's a pretty hot issue, and I have got a lot of hate just recently on that particular video. I'm not quite sure why. I don't know whether a load of new people have found it or what, but I have got recently quite a lot of hate over that video. But I do what I do, and it works. So if people want to disagree, that's okay too. All right, let's see what else we've got here.
One thing you can try for your male, because spawning can take a lot out of both parties, beef heart soaked in Celcon. I've found that just makes them put on weight so fast. And if you have access to them, like if you have them in your cupboard for whatever reason, those little fish oil tablets that people take for like heart health and stuff, those you can actually pop and squeeze right onto the food, and that will fatten them up too.
Okay. Oh, okay. I could certainly try. Yeah, because I was looking at him today, and I mean, I've been doing a lot of bloodworms, but he just doesn't see. I'm quite shocked how much it has taken out of him. Despite, I mean, obviously I started feeding him up once I took him out, because he would not eat when he was in there. So I mean, he was probably 5-6 days maybe. where he just didn't eat, and now obviously I've been feeding. She looks great. She's really chunky and looks great, but I was quite shocked how thin he was actually looking. So I'll try that and see.
That's part of why I caution people, to be careful when they have a male who can constantly see females, because if you're not planning on breeding him, just what it takes for him to constantly produce milk and be ready to spawn, that can take a toll. Typically, over the years, my fish have lived anywhere from like 5 to 8, even sometimes longer. But the males that I spawned more frequently, they were the ones who usually 5 years was the max I got.
Now, here's a question I get very often. Give me your opinion on this one. I get, obviously, because we sell the tank dividers, I get very often, is it okay to put a male and a female in the tank, even if it's divided? What would you say to that?
I honestly think it depends on the fish. I think if they can't constantly see each other, but they know each other is there, it might be an issue. But if your male isn't just constantly crazy bubble nesting and flaring at the divider and, crazy bubble nesting, flaring at the divider, if they're just swimming around normally and sometimes they acknowledge each other, I'd say you're fine. It's
okay. Yeah. So what about hormones? Would they sense each other and the hormones that they release? Would that be an issue or no?
A lot of people say they do sense the hormones, but I've never noticed one way or another in making a difference in how I condition, whether I have the female in a net so she and the male are in the same water, or, just a glass jar. Personal opinion, I don't think it's an issue. Like I said, I think it's fish to fish, but unless you see an issue, unless your fish are just frantically, constantly ready to spawn and constantly exhibiting spawning behavior, I'd say you're fine.
Okay. That's interesting. Okay. All right. Let's see what we have here. Lost. Okay, so Sherry Sweeney says, "Hi Sheila and Amber, I want to breed, but I'm not sure when they are ready." So for me, I set up the tank, and then the male went in, and then I put the female in. And when I say put her in, she was in a breeding container, and I put her just a little away from where I set up the nest. Or that I say set up the nest, I put the bubble wrap on so that was where he built the nest. And then for us, we actually couldn't see the breeding stripes. Usually they will get sort of like vertical, it is vertical, yeah, vertical stripes. And that's when you would know. Also, they get very eggy as well, or sort of they get a lot bigger with eggs. But for us, we couldn't really see that because of her colouring. None of that really showed up. So for me, it was just when she was showing an awful lot of interest and he was going backwards and forwards, and she did look really big as well. So I would say that was how it worked for me. And then when I let her out, within a very, very short space of time, they were actually breeding. Now, I'm sure it's probably different in every case. No two fish are going to be the same for sure. So what worked for me may not work for you, but that is how I did it. And obviously, I've only done it once. So over to you, Amber, on that one.
So, yeah, like you said, I conditioned my pair first. I like to put the pair next to each other for a little while, about a week, before I want to spawn them, feed them up very heavily. Then I'll put the male in the spawn tank, put the female next to it, let the male, be all macho and claim territory and swim around and bubble nest. Once he seems very confident in the tank and he's bubble nesting pretty well, I'll add the female to a jar, add that to the tank, leave her for a couple days, still feeding heavily. And then when they're both showing interest and she is clearly eggy and her ovipositor, which is the egg spot, the little white spot between the ventral fins, when that's protruding and very visible, then I release her. Most of the females that I have right now or that I've worked with in the past either didn't show stripes or were, of a color that it was tricky to see, so I don't go based on stripes. I've also had females that displayed stress stripes while in the tank spawning with the male. I believe that's a sign, at least I think it was a sign of her being subordinate to him, and showing him, no, you're dominant. I'm not sure. That's just my theory, but yeah. And if I have a male that isn't really bubble nesting well, as long as he has a covered area that he's attempting to bubble nest in, I will still go ahead with adding her to a jar.
Okay. Now I've got a question here from Beta Josh. He says, "Hey Amber, how many times have you bred your betas?"
Oh God. The ones in this apartment are like grand total, because grand total it's dozens of times, if not more. I for many years hobby bred. So
yeah. All right. Let's see what else we've got on this. Okay. Let's see. Where are we? These comments. I'm trying to do it on my iPad because I can't see it on the screen. So I don't know whether you can find one to pick out, Amber. Oh, somebody's put. Here we go. This is a good one. My life as Jenny says. Do female beta fish eat their eggs if the male has no bubble nest?
No, I have found females usually only eat the eggs if they're unfertilized or they're kind of fungused up. Some pairs, either, the male or the female can do it. Some are egg eaters, but more often than not, there's a reason. A lot of bettas will also eat their eggs in times of stress, like if they feel threatened. That's a survival technique, because that nutrition they get from eating the eggs that, the potential threat might eat, instead they're eating it to get the nutrition to spawn later, because as we just said, spawning can take a lot out of them. So that sounds kind of awful, but it is a survival thing that they do. I've never really had females have too much of an issue with a male who didn't want to bubble nest. Most of my females are pretty well fed and, conditioned pretty well, and they're just ready to spawn. I've had many females spawn without a bubble nest, and actually the last spawn that I tried, the female, I added her to the tank. She kicked the male off of his nest and kept chasing him off of it. And within a couple hours, she was dropping her own eggs, picking them up, putting them into his nest, dropping her own eggs, picking him up, putting him into his nest, and just chasing him off into the corner. So.
Wow. Yeah, that just shows that there's just no one rule that you can say, this is the way to do it, or this is the way it's done, because, every fish is different, or every pair is different. And that's a classic example, of, and in fact, I actually found the same thing, because at first I thought that, sort of he was eating the eggs because he'd collect them, but he never went and put them sort of, up into the nest. He'd sort of go down, he'd eat, and this went on for time after time after time. And I just thought he was eating them. And then on one occasion, she went down and she managed to get some, and she took some up. She only did it the once that I saw. And then the next thing was, he was like spitting loads out into the nest. It was like, oh, he was holding them, but I thought he was eating them. I didn't realize that because I just thought they'd collect and then spit. But obviously they keep collecting, or, in this instance anyway, he kept collecting and then spat out into the nest. So I think that in that case, I don't know whether it was she showed him what to do, or whether he had been doing it and I just hadn't seen. But I didn't see him once do it until she'd done it, which I thought was, kind of neat. But she didn't do it again after that, or at least that I saw. And I put a chair and sat and watched them for quite a long time. So, but I didn't see her do it again.
I've had a lot of males who will pick up so many eggs that they literally have them falling out of their gills as they go up to the nest.
Oh, wow.
Get as many as possible.
Wow. You see, now I didn't know that, like in everything I'd read, or, because you just hear about how they collect the eggs and spit them in the nest. So, of course, I'm just thinking collect and spit, not like, spawn, collect, and then spit. It was like, oh, no, he's eating them. But anyway, thankfully he didn't. And we now have a lot of bouncing babies in the tank. So at least it did work out in the end. So, All right, let's see.
One person asked about a bubble nest, said that their fish has a bubble nest but no female. Why is this? It's because you have a betta fish. A lot of people want to say, they want to believe it's a sign of their betta being happy. I don't believe that's the case. I have seen many, floating with swim bladder disease in dirty waters of, the cold Petco cups blowing bubbles. It's just a survival thing. All animals have the instinct to procreate. It's a survival technique. It's, what they're made to do. So it's just them being ready in case a female happens to swim by because they still have that instinct. I don't think it has anything to do with it being healthy. Gouramis blow bubble nest as well.
Mm. Yeah, I see that bandied around a lot. It's, sort of my fish is happy because it's building a bubble nest. And I agree with you with that. I think it's just an instinct thing as over. I mean, I'm not saying they're not particularly happy. I'm not saying they're not happy, but I don't think it's necessarily a single sign of they're happy. Because most do it. Although actually, most of ours, mind you, we've only got 2 males right now, but most of ours don't. One does, but Bandit actually doesn't. He's only ever built one bubble nest, and that was, funny enough, during the hurricane. And he built a spectacular bubble nest in his tank. And that's the only time he's ever done it until he spawned. Prior to that, he's never built one. Whereas Theo, the koi male, he's always building them. He's just constantly building. But Bandit never did until he needed to do his thing.
Rain can actually trigger spawning behavior, and that's a retained behavior from the wild because in the rainy season, the water would be cleaner. So it would be a better time to spawn because fry would have a better chance.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
so
interesting.
I have better luck when it's raining too.
Yeah. All right, let's have a look.
One person asked, do I have issues getting crown tails to spawn? Absolutely. I used to have a huge issue with it because crown tails are in my experience, much more aggressive than other tail types. So are reds, for some reason. I've noticed red bettas tend to be more aggressive. I don't know if that's just me making a completely false observation, but that is one thing I've noticed. But crown tails are definitely more aggressive.
Yeah, I think they are overall, as in, generally, or I certainly know the ones that I've had. I've only ever had the female ones, and they have all been a lot more aggressive than the likes of half moons and even like the placotte females. They have been much more aggressive overall. Now, I've not had males, so I can't speak for males, but definitely the females for sure. All right, let's see.
I see one person saying that their betta built a bubble nest and they asked someone at the store, they got them from what it meant, and the store said it meant he was ready to breed. Please don't ever believe anything that someone who works at a pet shop tells you unless you've verified it with your own, research online, because more often than not, they're just trying to sell you a fish, or they're going based off one of the very, many prevalent misconceptions that surround bettas. So, and I don't mean to be harsh by saying that, just always back up what someone says. Like, much of what I'm saying is my opinion. Like, it is my opinion and in my experiences that Veiltail's dominant. Other people may have had different experiences. That's just what I'm going off of. So I think you should always verify what someone says on your own and do your own research.
Yeah, I agree with that. I saw I won't go into the details on it in case people also saw the post, but I did see a post today that somebody had said that the pet store had told them it wasn't to do with betta fish, it was a different species of fish, but basically that it was having a air stone in the tank that had killed a fish, and it was plainly obvious it was the stocking of the tank and just totally inappropriate tank size and the fish that were in the tank, and yet she was just fighting with everybody on Facebook that it was the air stone that had killed. And I just thought, you can't like you say, you can't listen. You need to, okay, if they give you information, then go home and check it out. You know, there's so many resources on YouTube. There's great channels on YouTube. And, you know, there's loads of research on the internet as well. There's a lot of forums that you can go to and get advice. So, okay, if somebody tells you something at the store, you know, okay, take that information, but go and do something with that information. Check it out for yourself, as opposed to just going by what that one person tells you. Unfortunately, you know, people that work at pet stores aren't necessarily trained to take care of that specific animal. And so, you know, it is always good to do your own research anyway. I do think that's a good practice in any area, not even just fish keeping. In any area, I think it's a good practice. All right, so let's have a look. What else have we got here? So the male watched the egg. Nathan says the male watched the eggs overnight. The next morning there were 2 bubble nests and he was moving them all to the other nest. Then after I got home from work, I couldn't see a single egg. Now I was actually the same, Nathan. I thought the next morning when I came and looked, I thought they'd all gone. Literally, they'd all gone. And it was that he'd moved them, but I still couldn't see them. And it was only when I think it was by the second or third day, I've lost track now of the time. I think it was either the second or third day. I honestly didn't think there was anything in the tank. It just looked completely bare. But then I actually noticed it just looked like little hairs hanging down, and it turned out obviously that was the fish. So it doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing in there, unless obviously the bubble nest is completely gone. But if the bubble nest is there, then I would say give it a chance.
Yeah, I mean, it only takes 3 to 4 days. It's always worth waiting and seeing if anything happens. So,
yeah. Okay. So, where do I sell my bettas? Where do I sell my baby bettas? Please help. Weekly pet care. I would say, well, for me, I've done research beforehand, as in what is my end plan, because obviously you know you're going to end up with all these babies, so you need to make sure that you have an end game plan for them. So I have a relationship with a local fish store, so I know that some can go there. And then obviously for me, I do have YouTube, and we also have a large following on Instagram. So we do have a lot of interest in ours. If I wasn't doing it that way, then, or we didn't have YouTube and we didn't have Instagram, then I probably would have done a lot of research into what sells. If I really wanted to breed and have a go at it, then I would have probably done a great deal of research into, you know, what is very sought after, what do I want to work with. I do think that's important as well, but you do need to have an end game in where they are going to go. So I would suggest maybe, I don't know whether you can maybe do eBay or something like that, or maybe build a relationship with a local store and see if they will take some. Where do you sell yours, Amber?
Yeah, through online. A lot of people through my channel, which I didn't expect, but I mean, if people want the fish, that's fine. And also local fish shops. I think it's really important to have a backup plan before going into it, because you can end up with so many fish, and nobody wants to cull just because you have too many. So
yeah, that's not a good option, really. So my life, as Jenny says, should I get a filter? I'm scared she will get sucked into it and die. If your tank, I'm assuming you're talking about a betta fish tank, and if your tank doesn't have a filter, then you do need to be doing water changes extremely regularly, as in every few days. A sponge filter, personally, I think a sponge filter is the best option for a betta fish tank, because you can adjust the flow on it, so it doesn't need to be too strong. So a sponge filter is definitely the way to go on that. Again, depends on the size of your tank, but even if it's a small tank, you can get mini sponge filters, and we actually do sell the mini sponge filters. They're not that popular, but we actually do sell them, and they're very popular on our site because they will basically fit in any size tank. And because you can can adjust the flow on them with it's like a little valve that you can then plug into it, and then you can adjust it. Then you can have a very minimal flow if you've, say, got a very small tank at maybe 1 gallon, or if you're at 2 or 3 or 4 gallons or even 5 gallons, then it is a great filter for that. So for me personally, I would say yes to get a filter, and also a sponge filter is a good option.
Yeah, and one thing I would like to touch on is I'm seeing from my life as Jenny, it looks like she actually has a juvenile that she wants to add to a larger tank with an adult female. So I think it's a growing out situation. And she asked about using a 1 gallon and does she need a filter? And honestly, for growing out a juvenile, I would say 1 gallon is perfectly fine if you're willing to do the water changes. Betta splendens were developed, hundreds of years ago, and they have been bred and raised overseas. The ones you buy, in pet shops, they were imported in wholesale. They were raised in tiny little whiskey bottles. And I'm not exaggerating. If you look up on YouTube videos for Thai Betta farms, you will see these tiny little whiskey bottles that they're raised in. That's what they come from. That is their natural habitat. So I think to say that you can't keep one in a 1 gallon is untrue, but I think to say that it will have a better life and quality of life in a larger tank, I would say that that's true. And I would even say that, the more room a fish has to swim, the longer it's going to live, because the more, the healthier it's going to be. It's kind of like if you have 2 dogs and one gets exercised and the other doesn't. The one that gets exercised, chances are going to live longer. It's kind of like humans. If we just sit on our butts and do nothing, you're probably not going to live as long as somebody who goes out jogging every day. So you can do smaller. You definitely can. It's a matter of water changes. And I think a filter enables you to go longer without water changes. But you can do a 1 gallon. You just have to do enough water changes, and you have to, realize that an adult fish probably isn't going to have the kind of room to swim that it would like. Because they are active. If you put one in a 10 or a 20 gallon, they swim the whole length. They love it.
Yeah.
But to say that they cannot survive in a 1 gallon is completely erroneous. You just need to do water changes and make sure that the temperature is correct.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think when it comes to growing out fish, I think that, sort of 1 gallon and even under, like you say, is perfectly acceptable while they're growing out as far as jarring like males, but you have to be willing to do the water changes. I think that's the key. And it's not they're in that jar for life or they're in that container for life. They're in it while they grow out, waiting to go to the new home. And I think that's where sort of a lot of the channels that are showing things to do with breeding and fish in smaller containers, they're getting a lot of hate, because I think a lot of people don't understand that those fish aren't in those containers for life. They're there while they're being grown out or while they're being bred, or they then move on to a new home or a new life and hopefully a bigger tank. So there is a big difference when it comes to actually breeding bettas and how they're kept, and then obviously your pet fish bettas in how you would like them to end up. And I know for myself, I've sort of always said 2.5 minimum is a good tank size, but the more I see, in fact we've actually not got a 2.5 set up now, we've gone up to a 5 with a female in, and the more I see them sort of swimming around and how active they are, I would, at the risk of everyone going crazy, I'd probably say 5 is a good minimum, just because they are a very active fish, and because they've been so abused in the trade by pet stores saying, I think, is it PetSmart have is it a quart tank set up now, and they've got like these little tiny cube half-gallon ones, and when you've got pet stores doing that, people think that's okay because the pet store says it's okay. They don't go home then and do research. Whereas if you actually research the fish, they do swim so much, and they are a very active fish, very curious fish. And I think it's important to give them that space, but there is the difference between breeding them and keeping them as pets. And I think that's where the crossover and all the arguments basically start, in the difference of opinions. All
Absolutely.
right.
And I would also agree with you that 5 is a good minimum, because for me at least, a 5-gallon with one betta and, maybe a snail, I'm going to be changing 50% of the water out once a week. 2.5, that's going to be, 30% twice a week.
Yeah.
A 1 gallon is going to be at least 50% every other day, and then a full change once a week. So I'd agree with you. 5-gallon, change 50% once a week. That is the most realistic expectation for just, I want a betta fish, I'm not really a fish keeper type situation. If you're willing to do the water changes, I'd say go ahead. But yeah, a 5-gallon, they will definitely be more active in, and even a 10. So.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I agree with that as well. I do think, having seen mine in the 75-gallon when the girls were in there, and how active they were and how they really enjoyed all that space, it made me realize that I don't think there is a limit for them in and one of the things that, and I used to say this myself, is that they prefer long over tall, and I think that is true, in the sense of, because they like to swim, sort of across a tank rather than up and down a tank. And also, obviously, they're air breathing, so they need to get to the top of the tank. But what I found when they lived in the 75 was they basically lived in about the top third of it. And they just loved it because it was so heavily planted. They were just in and out of all the floating plants at the top, and that was like their domain. And then all the other fish we had were either bottom feeders or like middle swimmers. So it was just the perfect combination of what we had. But it proved to me that even a deep tank like a 75 or a 55, I used to sort of think, oh no, you can't do that. But you can, in that they basically live in the area that, it's a bit like sort of, fish that swim in the middle. That's because that's where they like to be. Whereas with betta fish, they are sort of more predominantly top swimmers in any tank. And so that's where they absolutely loved to live. So I don't really think there is a limit. People sort of put a limit on, oh, well, you can't go over a 20-gallon. And I don't know that I'd have said that, but I would have said that, a 20-gallon long is a great tank and probably the biggest. And whereas I think that I've probably changed my opinion greatly on that since keeping the girls in the 75. All right. Okay, let's see. I just have to read this comment. Rosebud 2010 MD says, I have a 20-gallon long with 3 dividers. Thank you, Sheila. It gives my males 5 gallons each, and they are so happy with the space. That's very, very nice to hear. A lot of people do divide it 3 ways, and some people divide it 4 ways. But that is, that's really good to hear. And 5 gallons of space is excellent as well for each one. Okay, I think we'll just do one more question, and then I think we'll call it a night. I can't believe we've been going for an hour. That was so quick. So quick. My goodness. All right. You want to pick the last question, Amber? Is there anything that stands out?
Can we actually do 2 really quick? Because one is a one-word answer. Can females make bubble nests? Absolutely. I've had many do that. Females can make bubble nests. And can you keep a male? Oh, it skipped up. Can you keep a male with another female betta or in a female sorority? I wouldn't. I think it's a huge stress on both parties, and I think you're probably going to end up with at least one fish getting injured. I wouldn't do it, and I would very much advise against it. How about you, Sheila?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there's several videos keep popping up on YouTube with people having done it. And all I would say is just look very closely at the fish and the behaviors and the nip fins. And to me, it's not always as it seems. So, no, it's definitely not something I would advise. And it is certainly not something I would do either. So I think that, if you're watching videos or seeing people do it, then you need to look closely, not just look at the surface, oh, the tank's pretty, or, oh, look, they're together. You need to look at the way they're swimming, the posturing, and, like say, also look at the fins, because very often that is a big telltale sign. So no, definitely wouldn't do it. All right, guys, I am going to stop it right there. And thank you so much for joining us. I can't believe an hour has gone by. We will do something like this again. If you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up so that we know that you did enjoy this. And so maybe we can make this a fairly regular thing. I want to say thank you to Amber for joining us. She has the experience in all this and has been a great help to me. If you're not subscribed to her channel, go on over and subscribe. just go over, check it out. She's got some interesting videos on there, and she does do a lot to do with breeding as well. So if that's something you're interested in, then she's a good source of information. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for having me. And also, any questions we didn't get to, if you want to leave them in the comments of the upload later, we'll probably get to them there.
Yeah, we certainly will. All right, bye, guys.
Bye.